Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Trump imposes an additional 10% tariff globally, justifying it with another law that doesn't really give him the authority to do it, from MSN.com, posted by Plasman30. And that's linked to an article. Trump announces 10% global tariff after raging over Supreme Court loss from CNBC, and it looks like it's all hosted on the MSN website, but it looks like CNBC was the actual publishing outlet. But yeah, personally, if Trump wants to have a new make any tariffs, ultimately, the Supreme Court said he can't do that. But just because the Supreme Court says something doesn't mean he has to abide by it. Ultimately, power is whatever those in the positions of authority are willing to justify. Power is what those in charge say it is. Pretty much. And a lot of people are going to defer to what the president says. The Supreme Court might say, might rule one way, but ultimately, a lot of times courts aren't in a position to actively enforce the law. You can say that same about the presidents and the executive branch, but a lot of people are going to defer to what they say. So ultimately, even if the Supreme Court rules one way and Trump wants to justify doing something his way, ultimately that's very much what Trump usually does. He doesn't usually care for whatever the Congress or the Supreme Court says. He usually just does whatever he wants, and that's pretty much ultimately what power is. People might say, "Oh, well, checks and balances," but ultimately, checks and balances don't really matter when a lot of people are just going to defer to whatever the president says. But personally, I don't think it really matters. I think it's all just a distraction from because the president pretty much just a figure at this point. That's why Prince just Trump. He's just a figure to distract people with his WWE stuff like this. When in reality, the deep state like the CIA, FBI, NSA, and all the other Balfour agencies are the ones who are really running the country, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, did Trump's insults actually give Thomas Massie a political advantage? From CourierJournal.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Thomas Massie subreddit. And yeah, I would say that Trump's so unpopular right now that him going after Thomas Massie might actually be politically helpful to him. But regardless, I definitely do think a lot of people who Trump goes after do usually get kicked out of the party and end up irrelevant. People like Jeff Flake, the former senator from Arizona, or Mike Pence, Trump's first vice president. But ultimately, I do think it's probably as good a time as any to actually be against Trump and have him insulting you, because he seems to be unpopular. He's becoming more unpopular by the day. But ultimately, you can make a case really for either or. That Trump's insults might hurt or help Thomas Massie. But I guess we'll have to wait and see what the results of his primary versus I think Ed Gowring are. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Chinese news. The leash on the high ground has run out, posted by Donald Key, and that's cross-post from the Epstein subreddit. And that looks like it's since been removed by moderator. But, yeah, ultimately I think it's interesting how Reddit says, oh, don't believe any propaganda, but they almost always exclusively believe whatever the Chinese media tells them, because, of course, after the DNC, I would say the CCP is probably one of the greatest astroturfers on all of Reddit. And, ultimately, if you want to believe whatever Chinese news says or what Russia Today says, believe whatever you want to. But, I think it's interesting how the same people who say, oh, Russia's influence in our election are sharing Chinese news without a second thought about it. That just goes to show you, if they didn't have double standards, they'd have no standards at all. That's very much how it is when it comes to politics. People don't really have any standards, only teams. But yeah, I guess I would kind of agree that at least on the high ground has run out. The U.S. government clearly doesn't have the moral high ground. But then again, the Chinese government doesn't really either, with stuff like the Uyghur genocide and all that. Ultimately, all governments are going to be corrupt in their own way, regardless of how prominent they are on the world stage, I would say. Next we have, following today's SCOTUS decision, Governor Pritzker sent a letter and invoice to the president demanding the return of $8.6 billion, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's a cross-post from the Illinois subreddit. And that looks like a letter from Governor Pritzker to Donald Trump, a screenshot of it at least. President Donald Trump's address. President Donald Trump's White House, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue West, Washington, D.C., 20500. President Trump, your tariff taxes wreaked havoc on our farmers, enraged our allies, and sent grocery prices through the roof. This morning, your hand-picked Supreme Court justice notified you that they are also unconstitutional. On behalf of the people of Illinois, demand a refund of $1,700 for every family in Illinois. There are 5,105,448 houses in my state, bringing the total damages to you owed to $8,679,261,600. The Supreme Court has ruled that this is yet one more unconstitutional act by you and your administration. The letter and the attached invoice stand as an official notice that compensation is owed to the people of Illinois. If you do not comply, we will pursue further action. Sincerely, J. Pritzker, Governor of Illinois. And yeah, personally, if Pritzker wants to send that letter, I think he should be able to, freedom of speech and all that. But, ultimately, I think it's interesting, how he cares so much about tariffs, but, he doesn't care about any other taxes, and it just goes to show, it's all just kind of grandstanding on his part. He's probably one of my least favorite Democratic politicians right now. I think it's interesting. Democrats say, oh, we hate billionaires, yet they're completely fine with J.B. Pritzker, the billionaire governor of Illinois, because he has the correct letter next to his name. And yeah, if he wants to make a bitch about tariffs, I think that's fine. But it's not a principled anti-tariff stance. It's more of just a principled orange. It's more of just a generic Reddit orange man bad stance. He's completely fine for all the taxes his state already imposes. But since the orange man has his tariffs, suddenly they're the worst thing ever. And it just goes to show you that, he doesn't really have any principles other than, just like a lot of writers, he's just orange man bad, no other values or besides that. I'm sure if Biden was passing these same tariffs, Pritzker would think they're the greatest idea ever. But, since the orange man is doing them, suddenly they're the worst thing ever. Next they have, so pro-life they want to kill you, posted by Donald Key, and that's crosspost from the Newsom Massacre subreddit. From bans to death sentences, how is this even real? And that's a tweet from Carolyn Orbueno, who tweeted, Republicans in Tennessee are trying to pass a bill that would allow the state to execute women who have abortions with no exception to the law for rape or incest. And there's a headline from Tennessee under that TM bill would allow death penalty for women who have an abortion. And then they have a tweet from a Blue Sky Post from Tennessee Holler, tweeted, correct. Rep. Jody Barrett left, Senator Mark Pody right, and that was them, quote, tweeting, I am Dan Levy, tweeted, these are two Republican lawmakers Tennessee who proposed a bill that would allow death penalty for women who have abortions. And yeah, personally, I would say I'm more on the anti-capital punishment side and more on the pro-choice side. But, ultimately, if the state wants to kill you for any reason, ultimately, it does have legal monopoly and use the force to do so. I personally think, as long as the baby's inside the woman, ultimately, it's her body to do what she wants with. If it's outside, ultimately, I do get to be more pro-life after that. But ultimately, I do think, abortion is very much a personal matter rather than one that should be involved. The state should be involved in, just like pretty much everything else. I personally don't really care for a lot of Democrats or rhetoric around abortion. I liked it back in the 90s when it was safe, legal, and rare. Now it's, it's just women's health care and it's empowering to women, kinda. And I personally think that's going too far. They gotta go back to safe, legal, and rare. But, I definitely do think, the libertarian position is, the state shouldn't be involved with it, just like everything else, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, small business owners celebrate Supreme Court striking down Trump's tariffs, from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, I personally do think that, it's good that they're striking down Trump's tariffs, but, it doesn't really matter if Trump's not going to listen to them. Ultimately, the Supreme Court, since they don't have an enforcement arm, ultimately they can make whatever their ruling they want to, and people can just choose to ignore it if they feel like it. Next we have, GOP turns Arizona license plate into a Turning Point fundraiser, posted by Donald Key, and that's crosspost from the Newsom Massacre subreddit. And that looks like a tweet from the real fellow Johnson, who tweeted, Jay Kaufman has got millions from Turning Point in the past 4 years. This legislation would see $8 going to the state and $17 per license plate of taxpayer money going to Turning Point USA. And that was her quote tweeting Jay Kaufman. Charlie Kirk Memorial license plate legislation is officially passed the Arizona Senate. It's headed to the House. Thank you to Republican colleagues for supporting the tribute to my dear friend Charlie Kirk, for Charlie. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, if the state wants to have turning point license plates and wants to make them optional, ultimately they can just find wherever they want to. I'm sure a lot of Redditors will bitch, oh, they can't have the state shouldn't be giving money towards political groups. But Redditors are always fine when it comes to their side of the government funneling money to progressive NGOs and all that. So ultimately, the U.S. government can spend, and the state governments or any government can spend money on whatever it wants to, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. If you don't like Charlie Kirk and don't want to get his license plate, I think you shouldn't have to. But ultimately, if there ever comes a time when there's an LGBTQ group saying, "Oh, we're having LGBTQ license plates," and you're not against that for the same reasons you're against this, it just shows you're a hypocrite with no values, only teams. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have meme I made on true experiences, posted by NICKL. Well, NI_C_KL, and that's crosswords from the Libertarian meme subreddit, and it's looks like a gorilla. It looks like some jaguar or a leopard or some big cat with the Republican elephant and the Democrat donkey over it, and then a gorilla just kind of standing there smugly with the Libertarian porcupine over it, and says how it feels after seeing Republicans and Democrats getting pissed on your Libertarian post on Reddit. And yeah, I would agree with that. Being libertarian means you might piss off both of the major parties a lot because you dare dissent from them. Increasingly the two major parties don't allow any dissent whatsoever. I think that's the important thing about the Libertarian Party, that it allows much more dissent than the two major parties do. And yeah, I think that's very much the Libertarian position. You shouldn't always be saying whatever the party line is. You should be thinking for yourself and saying whatever you think, rather than just going over whatever the party line is, I would say. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Texas public school teachers now required to post the Ten Commandments in their classroom. Here's how one teacher is handling it. Posted by Donald McKee, and that's cross-posted from the BMA subreddit. It looks like they have it on a cabinet with a bunch of other things, like the 7 fundamental tenets from some other religion, I guess. And then they have an I am a Hindu poster, Buddhism knowledge. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, if teachers want to display the Ten Commandments in their classroom, they should be able to display whatever they want to. I think it's interesting. A lot of writers say, "Oh, you can't display the Ten Commandments in your classroom," but every classroom needs to have a pride flag because Reddit hates indoctrination. But if it's leftist and progressive indoctrination, suddenly it's completely fine. But I think the libertarian perspective is, we just gotta get rid of public schools altogether. I would say public schools are going to be inherently biased. That's why I think the libertarian perspective is, at this point, any school's gonna try and push their values onto kids. So I think maybe at this point we just should have private schools. Maybe you could have some that are progressive, some that are conservative, some that are more libertarian. Each one could have a different ideological bent based on what the parents want. I think that's very much the libertarian position, rather than having government-run public schools that the state can enforce and then put whatever they want in their classrooms. Like, they could say, oh, we need to force everyone to put the Ten Commandments in each classroom. Or, if there's a progressive that says, oh, we have to have everyone have the pride flag in every classroom. I think the libertarian perspective is, the state has too much, should have no role in education, just like it has no role in everything else. And that's my thoughts there. And it looks like that's it. So we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.